Are authoritarian governments better suited to combat a global pandemic, or will they crumble as a result of one, and only democracy will survive? The COVID-19 virus started in the Wuhan province of China. The virus is thought to be a result of the poor sanitation and abundance of exotic animals from the wet markets in the villages of Wuhan. These markets are different from butcher or deli shops, as the animals are sold while still alive. Back in 2006, these wet markets were the cause of the avian virus. The Chinese government and the rest of the world were able to respond to this virus and stop it from becoming a global pandemic. Despite the avian virus warning, China refused to close down its wet markets, and now a new virus has emerged, the COVID-19 virus, which has become a global pandemic. Despite this occurring and the UN biodiversity chief calling for the banning of wet markets, China once again reopened them. Contrary to what might look like gross negligence on the part of the Chinese government, this could actually be seen as the Chinese government listening to its people. Open-air markets are a historic part of Chinese culture, and many Chinese people themselves do not want to give them up. Despite China listening to its people on cultural issues, it did not listen to its people on scientific issues. In a ploy to keep their population from mass panic, the Chinese government censored Dr. Li Wenliang from sounding the alarm on just how serious the virus was. This doctor ended up dying from the very disease he was trying to combat. China has also projected its influence abroad to silence criticism about its handling of the virus. The Chinese government told the World Health Organization that it had the virus contained, and the World Health Organization told the world that travel restriction to and from China would not be necessary. Despite these examples of authoritarian corruption, China has some advantages in handling the virus that democratic regimes do not. For example, Chinese police can barricade people into their homes. These measures have been so effective that the Chinese government has reported that it had 82,000 cases and 3,300 deaths, compared to the United States' 189,000 cases and 3,300 deaths in the beginning of April. Yet, many have looked at these numbers with suspicion, as China has over 1 billion more people than the US, was where the virus started, and has far larger and more densely packed cities than the United States. It turns out these suspicions were justified, as whistleblowers from China have since revealed that China is indeed falsifying its numbers. This has since led to great suspicion among the people of China and governments around the world, and the Chinese government's role in covering up the virus, and consequently exacerbating the situation. Chinese writers and whistleblowers have critiqued the government and are especially displeased in China's underreporting of its infection rates. Even the Iranian government, an ally of China and enemy of the US, has called the Chinese infection rate numbers a bitter joke. The Chinese government has begun instituting measures to curb the virus, such as requiring citizens to scan a QR code every time they enter a store to monitor their movements. This is unlikely to end once the pandemic is over, and thus will grant the Chinese government greater control over its people. However, it will have less control over the international community, as it will be highly skeptical of China going into the future, and probably openly hostile towards China for its role in the COVID-19 epidemic. It will remain to be seen whether China can keep its population from turning their fear of the virus into hostilities towards their government, and if China's authoritarian practices will help curb the spread of the virus in its country. The United States currently has the largest official infection rate in any country. The US government also tried to downplay the virus, with the president saying in late January that the government had the virus totally under control. However, the US has an advantage over China, being that they are a democratic regime, and thus the media and opposing government officials were able to warn the public about the virus, with several governors issuing state quarantine measures long before the federal government's announcement of a federal quarantine. However, this autonomy that the states have can also be used the other way around, as currently several states have begun to ease quarantine laws, despite there being no cure or vaccination for the virus. In the United States' case, distrust of the federal government's handling of the virus is not as big of a problem for the government itself as in China. This is because the United States holds elections for control of the government, and there is an election coming up next year that will be heavily decided by how Americans view the current administration's handling of the virus. If Americans disapprove of their government's handling, they will not re-elect the current regime. If Americans approve, then Donald Trump will remain in office. Even if leaders from both sides of the political spectrum have failed to provide sufficient relief for the majority of Americans, partisanship will prevent Americans from blaming the government as a whole, instead of blaming one party. And thus, the threat to the government will not be as severe as it would be in China, as there is only one party to blame in that country. Italy is a democratic country that has been severely hit by the pandemic. Through reasons still unclear, much like the Black Plague pandemic of medieval times, Italy was the first Western country to be hit with the virus. Many in Western countries have seen terrifying diseases from outside the West flare up, with media speculating about a global pandemic, only to have the virus be contained in a few years. Thus, Italian citizens and lawmakers had little worry over the virus, with several lawmakers concluding that the economy must remain open. After all, Italy was finally starting to recover from the Great Recession, and could not afford to stop its economy now. Thus, the virus spread, and now Italy has the second highest per capita death rate, beaten out only by Spain, a country that followed a similar path as Italy, but was struck even harder by the Great Recession, and thus had even less resources to combat the virus. Italy is definitely an example of how a democracy can fail at preventing the spread of a virus by listening to a wishful population and prioritizing short-term economic gain. Uzbekistan is an authoritarian regime in the heart of Central Asia that for a long time was reporting that it had no coronavirus cases. This could be seen as believable, as the country is doubly landlocked, surrounded by sparsely populated countries, and receives very little tourism due to heavy government regulation, despite the beauty of Samarkand. However, the government has since reported over 2,000 cases and 10 deaths. This is because the virus presents an enormous opportunity for the Uzbek government to gain even more power over its population. Uzbekistan had previously lifted restrictions on banned media sites, but in the wake of the virus has reinstated them. In fact, citizens are banned from even handing over their phones to one another. This could be seen as a way to prevent the spread of germs. However, the fact that this rule particularly relates to the handing over of cell phones, and the fact that people have used phones to film the conditions of the quarantine in Uzbekistan, makes it more likely that this is a measure the government is taking to stop the spread of dissent over the government's handling of the virus. So far, South Korea has been the nation most successful in stopping the spread of the virus. South Korea is a democratic regime. However, the people did have to sacrifice their freedom in order to stop the spread of the virus. This was mainly their use of broadcasting where infected people were in real time, and using this to track down people suspected of having contracted the virus. Francis Fukuyama stated it best, that the type of government will not be responsible for how a country deals with the virus, but rather the people's trust in the government. As we have seen examples of democracies, dictatorships, and everything in between fail or succeed at stopping the spread of the virus. Thank you guys so much for watching what I think is probably my longest video now. That was actually an essay that I had to do, or a final that I had to do for college, and I thought it would make a really nice geopoll actually. So thank you guys for watching that video, and remember to subscribe if you have not yet.